I'm excited to be here with you all tonight. Tonight's a little different. I'm not a preacher. I try to be a teacher. You all can decide if I do any good at that by the end of the night. But as we go through the night, if you have any burning questions, hang on to that and make sure that you come up and ask me here at the end, because when we're done, we're not done. I'm here till you all are tired of talking to me and looking at artifacts, and then we'll be done, all right? So keep that in mind. Now, a little bit of an introduction. My day job is I'm Chief Assistant Pike County Attorney. And I already had somebody ask me, can I drop your name if I get a ticket in Pike County? All right. So the job I have, or the volunteer job, my hobby job as I like to call it, is I'm a square supervisor at the Shiloh excavation in Israel. Now, I may break over tonight and call it Shiloh. That's because in Israel, that's how you say it, okay? So if you hear me say Shiloh, it's Shiloh, all right? I am seeking a master's in biblical history and archaeology. I'm starting my biblical Hebrew or ancient Hebrew this fall. Y'all pray for me. I ain't good at languages. Can't imagine an Eastern Kentucky hillbilly would struggle with languages, but you know, that's my next tough subject. And I've directed 2 different biblical archaeology museum projects. Now, they can't be with me tonight, but I always like to show you my most important job, and that's a husband and a father. And so that's my girls. If the one in the middle was with me, then she'll be up front tonight, and she would try her best to do all the talking. And so she's decided she's going to marry Indiana Jones and be an archaeologist when she grows up. I think I'm proud. I'm not sure yet. Certainly the archaeology part I'm good with. The Indiana Jones guy, I love him. I want to be him when I grow up, but he's a little bit, I don't know if I want my daughter married him. Now, I'm here on behalf of the University of Pikeville, and then a group you need to know about. If you're interested in biblical apologetics, archaeology, or, and I'll talk about it in a minute, if you hear somebody makes a statement about the Bible that they say something like, well, the Bible's not true, blah, blah, and we know that, blah, blah. Here is the resource for you to go to. Associates for Biblical Research, or ABR, has been in existence for over 40 years to challenge the skeptics on the historical reliability of the Bible. All right? Now, our video partner is In Grace with Jim Scudder. If you may have seen him on TBN, but I've got to give a little credit because they allow me to use their wonderful video content, as we'll see it tonight. So today's presentation is a little different. Tonight's about having a little fun and hopefully learning a little something. We're going to examine artifacts, we're going to look at original videos from Israel, and we're going to study the biblical text in detail. We're going to hopefully illuminate Scripture with archaeology, and maybe even talk about the original languages a little bit. But here's my main goal. Number 1, if one person in this room, you leave here and I've encouraged you to read your Bible in a deeper fashion or more often, I've done my job. All right? And number 2, which is really why I do these presentations, there are all kinds of young people in this room, and that's who I like to talk to. Because I'm going to tell you, Mom, Dad, Grandma, Grandpa, if you do not know, when your children go away to public universities, and sadly, some so-called Christian universities today, they're going to be taught the Bible is nothing but a collection of morality tales to teach you how to act, and they're not history and they're not true. If you are listening to me talk tonight and you remember nothing else you hear me say, you remember when you hear that junk that Tommy said, bull, and go do your homework. Because when you do your homework, you're almost always going to find the answer and you're going to find the Bible reliable. All right? Now, with that said, we're going to dive right in, and tonight we're going to go from the world before Abraham down to the time of Jesus. We're going to look at artifacts and different archaeological sites. We'll spend quite a bit of time in the Old Testament, but we're going to talk about a variety of subjects, and tonight you all are going to get a bunch of what I call samples of entire presentations that you take an hour, and I've got 5 minutes to cover the information, all right? So, we'll start with the world before Abraham. The first artifact I do want to point out, just because it's the oldest one here on loan from the Horn Museum, is this cuneiform tablet right here in the middle of our display. It dates to 2600 BC, all right? You see the seated figure here in the middle of the tablet? He's sitting on a throne, he has a horned helmet, and in front of him is a crescent moon. This is the Sumerian moon god. His name is Sin, all right? And this is the world before Abraham. And why do I point that out? When Abraham is born and comes into the world, do the people believe in one God or many? Many. I heard many. That's the world Abraham is born into, all right? And so when we look at the biblical chronology, Abraham was born around 2166 BC. If you believe the Bible, I do, all right? And we do have another cuneiform text that I specifically asked for the museum. And it's this little one right here. So let's take a look at it. I'll show you a picture of the front and the back. I'll tell you why in a minute. And I'm going to read it to you. And we're going to see if this cuneiform text from the year 2037 BC has any great secrets from the ancient world for us. It says, one dead goat received from Lugo Mashtaba, sealed by Lucala. The month of the feast of Shulgi, the year Hunri was destroyed. Lucala the scribe, son of Eurychus. Well, it's a contract for a dead goat. Somebody thought 4,000 years ago that was important enough to write down. What in the world does this have to do with the world of Abraham? What is Abraham's wealth measured in? Livestock, generally, yeah. And what we find when we study these cuneiform tablets from that time, they are almost everyday life. They are items recording transactions. And it ain't, I gave him 150 gold pieces. It's livestock. Just like we see in the Bible. Just like the description we have in Abraham, of Abraham. Now this particular one, why did I want it? Because it gives us a date. It says the month of the feast of Shulgi, the year Hunri was destroyed. Now I know everybody knows what Hunri was destroyed. I don't either, but the experts do. The year was 2039 BC, and by the biblical chronology, a guy named Abraham was 127 years old. He had a son named Isaac. The year that cuneiform tablet was written, it was 27. All right? So we literally are looking at an artifact from the lifetime of Abraham. All right? So check that out. Now, we're going to jump around a bit, but we're going to dive first into one of my favorite favorite topics from the Bible, and it's the story of the Exodus. All right? I am preparing a new presentation that's 90 minutes long on the Exodus alone, and we've got maybe 5 or 10 minutes to cover the same kind of stuff here. Right? So let's hit the gas and see what we can do, okay? First, if you are not aware, I'm going to give you what you're likely to encounter when you turn on secular TV and you watch and they talk about the Exodus. It's going to be something like this. They're going to say the time of the Exodus was the 13th century BC. The 1200s BC, all right? And they're going to say something like this. If there was an Exodus, it occurred in the 13th century BC. However, there is no evidence of an Exodus at that time. And they say there's no Semites in Egypt. This is the very common date and the common position you'll see in most literature and most so-called experts. All right? That's what they talk about when they talk about the Exodus. If you've heard it, you probably heard it before. There's no evidence of any Exodus from Egypt. All right? Well, we won't go into all of that. If you really want to know, invite me back and we'll do the full presentation. But we're going to talk about it a little bit tonight. First, do they have the right date? That's a pretty good, important question. As Dr. Stripling says, you can look at the right place at the wrong time and you're not going to find anything. All right? So most things you look at, most even Bible encyclopedias and stuff you look up will say the Exodus was in the 1200s. Does the Bible say that? So, when did the Exodus occur? Let's go to the text. 1 Kings 6:1. Solomon began to build the temple for the Lord in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of his reign over Israel. Okay? Now, that is an interesting clue. Most scholars agree that we know the date Solomon began the temple. Okay? That's the year 967 BC. Considered a rather firm date in ancient history. So, if we add 479 years to that, because it was in the 480th year, not after. I don't know what happened there. All right, we get to 1446. That's in the 15th century. Ladies and gentlemen, does that sound like the 1200s to you? Absolutely not. So, that is during one of the greatest dynasties of Egyptian history, the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom. So let's look at an interesting clue from the text. Some verses from Exodus 2, 3, and 4. When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help ascended to God because of the difficult labor. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire within a bush. Now in Midian, the Lord told Moses, return to Egypt, for all the men who wanted to kill you are dead. The text seems to suggest that the Pharaoh who wanted to kill Moses has now died, and now God is sending him back to Egypt. That's probably pretty familiar verses for most of us that attend church and grew up in church, aren't they? All right? So, here's a question. Does anybody remember how long Moses was in the wilderness before he went back to Egypt? 40 years. Okay. Now, that's important. So, if Moses is in the wilderness for 40 years, the Bible seems to suggest that he's only returning to Egypt when the Pharaoh who wanted him has died. Who wanted to kill him is now dead, all right? So here's the thing. How long does that Pharaoh has had to be on the throne? 40 years, minimum. It's a long time. So in the 18th dynasty, which is the 1400s, when the Bible would put it, we find a Pharaoh named Tutmosis III. He was considered one of the greatest pharaohs of Egyptian history. They actually call him the Napoleon of Egypt, okay? He reigned for 54 years. Now, guess what? He's the only pharaoh in that time frame that reigned for 40 years or more. What was the clue we just had? It seems to suggest that Pharaoh had to reign 40 years. The Pharaoh that Moses ran from. Remember, he kills the Egyptian. He runs off and God says, the burning bush, you can go back now. Those who wanted you dead are dead. Seems to tell us the Pharaoh had reigned for 40 years. There's only one Pharaoh that meets that criteria. His name is Tutmosis III. Okay? Tutmosis III reign is right in the middle of the 1400s. Now, an interesting artifact. Okay? We have an Egyptian scarab. Scarabs were popular amulets and seal impressions in ancient Egypt. Let's look at one on display from the 18th dynasty. I want you to notice the sphinxes and the mirror image cartouches. You may know what a cartouche is? We're going to have a vocabulary test after. All right? A cartouche, it's a circle ring in Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's got a little dash on the bottom and the hieroglyphics on the inside. I always tell kids, if you want to impress mom and dad when you go to the museum, when you see the hieroglyphics, find the circle with the dash and say, Mom and Dad, this is a cartouche? What? And that's the name of a pharaoh. So if you see a cartouche, only the name of a pharaoh is allowed inside. Now up here, right here in our display, is an Egyptian scarab. And you'll see the sphinx, they're mirror images. Do you see the cartouche here and here? See the hieroglyphs? Now, I'm no expert on Egyptian hieroglyphics, but I know the guy who is. Dr. Petrovich, whenever we were getting items for our museum collection, said, Tommy, you want this scarab? I'm like, okay. Dr. Petrovich, why do I want this scarab? He said, do you know whose name is in the cartouche? He's dragging me on, baiting me out. I'm like, Dr. Petrovich, you know I can't read it. He said, his name is Tutmosis III. Do you know who that is? And I smiled. I said, yeah. He said, that's the Pharaoh that Moses ran from. He said, bingo. So, on display in your church tonight is a scarab of, we believe, the very Pharaoh of the oppression, the only Pharaoh of the 18th dynasty that matches the 40-year period. But I want to talk about his son. His name was Amenhotep II. There's Amenhotep. He's the son of Tutmosis III. By the Egyptian chronology, the ABR follows, he would have been Pharaoh around the year 1446 BC. Why was that number important? When did I tell you that the Exodus occurred? All right. In ancient Avaris, otherwise known as Tel el-Daba, in an area of the Nile area you would call Goshen, was the remains of a large city. Now, that city was excavated by a non-Bible believing German archaeologist who did excellent archaeological work. All right. And what he discovered was a large city that began several hundred years before and had a very small Semitic population. You know what a Semite is? A Semite is from the area of Canaan. All right? Ladies and gentlemen, what would an Israelite look like in the archaeological record? All right. And then that Semitic population at Tel el-Daba over the next 3 centuries exploded. It went from a small family to a large, large number of people. All right? And then something strange happened as he studied their bones. You learned a lot about people by looking at their graves and studying their graves. They were pretty well-to-do for a while. And near the end of the period, the expensive grave goods disappear, and the bones show evidence of strong stress, manual labor. What do you think that might be from? Making bricks, somebody said. All right. Now, if you asked the archaeologist, could this be the Israelites? He says, oh, no. He said, it's too early. These are not proto-Israelites. It's the 1400s. They would have been here in the 1200s. He never read his Bible. All right? So what we find in ancient Avaris is a city that was full of Semites, people from Canaan. It had a palace at the site. You notice it doesn't seem Moses takes a long time to get to go when he wants to talk to Pharaoh. One of the big criticisms from the so-called experts that criticize the Bible, well, we know that the Pharaoh's palace is down in central Egypt, and the Bible seems to show that Moses talks to him in a short time frame, but he's up in the north. And then we look at this site, and Amenhotep II has a palace right there at the site. All right? And guess what happened somewhere during Amenhotep II's reign? This whole city was abandoned. The archaeologist says it's as if everybody just packed up and moved off one day. The answer for them was, clearly it's a plague. I submit to you, it's a different answer. All right? And so we'll keep it short, but what I would tell you is when you hear there's no evidence of an Exodus, ask if they know when it happened. And when you look at the evidence, you find amazing evidence in Egypt. And this is all in the last 20 years, all right, that this has come out. Now, one final thing about Amenhotep II. Of course, if you haven't guessed, we believe he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He does something interesting in his reign. Even the experts will tell you his reign begins like many others, and it goes out on a whimper. See, most pharaohs invade the Levant. His dad sure did plenty of it. He did it early in his time, but around the year 1446 as we count it, he never went back to Canaan. He never took his army, and he never went there. I think there's a reason, all right? Now, with that said, we do have an interesting artifact on display I want you to see. I show you the little things I know you won't look at, all right? So, on this mirrored display is a little Egyptian plaque. On the back of it, or you can see the front of it here, there is a god and 2 goddesses, Egyptian, okay? On the back of it, we find some papyrus, and we find a what? What was the vocabulary word? Cartouche. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I can't read it, but Dr. Petrovich can. He said, Tommy, you know whose cartouche that is? No, Dr. Petrovich, I don't know. He said his name is Amenhotep II. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, on display is an actual artifact of the Pharaoh of the Exodus himself. All right? So, check those out. But if you want more details on that, I would encourage you to check at ABR. Or if I don't stink it up too bad tonight, maybe you want to say, come back sometime and give us the whole talk on that. All right? But we're going to move on to one of my favorite topics and one of the main purposes of ABR, and that's the conquest of Joshua. All right? So, the conquest of Joshua is a subject that we specifically focus on. And tonight we're going to look at 3. Actually, when I wrote this, it was 3. Now it's 4 different sites from the conquest. Each is an entire presentation on its own, and you're going to get the bare bones. So, we're going to start with a teaser photo, because I like to get your attention and shock you a little bit. And I want to show you a picture of me at a place called Jericho. Now, we all know the story of Jericho, don't we? And the walls came tumbling down. Now, if you haven't figured it out yet, Tommy's a Bible believer, and I'm going to maybe give you a hard thing to listen to, but I want you to hang in with me. See this big, thick stone wall behind me? This is the Middle Bronze Wall that was used through the Late Bronze. That big stone wall is the wall from the time of Joshua. It's not been restored, ladies and gentlemen. That wall never moved. Tommy, doesn't the Bible say it fell down? Hang in there. Give me a minute, okay? So, Jericho. What do the so-called experts say? Quotes like this. The huge ruins of the Hyksos city give rise to the folk tale attached to the hero Joshua. These are the things your children will be taught at public university. Stuff like this. The narrative of the capture of Jericho and Ai in the States, you probably hear it called Ai, and the conquest are devoid of historical reality. Or real simple, no evidence of invading Israelites at Jericho. All right, so that is the opinion of secular archaeologists and historians and what your kids are going to be taught at school. All right, is it so? Well, this is mainly based on the opinion of an archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon. She excavated Jericho in the 1950s, and when she went to excavate Jericho, one of her quotes was as follows: "I am unencumbered with any biblical baggage." Does that sound unbiased to you? Not to me, it doesn't. Dr. Kenyon probably lived an unbiblical lifestyle, I'll just say it like that. And we find people sometimes want to not believe the Bible and make certain conclusions. Here's the question. The world today goes with what Dr. Kenyon says. They never talk about the guy 20 years before, a guy named John Garstang who excavated before her, who wasn't a Christian, and said, isn't this interesting? The evidence matches the biblical text. She said it doesn't. All right. So, what does the evidence actually show? So the attorney in me, I don't want your opinion. I want to know what the evidence is. And unfortunately, when we talk about archaeology, most archaeologists' opinions are sold and put into the public as fact, not interpretation, not, fact. And so for me, I don't want to hear, don't give me what your opinion is. Give me the evidence, then give me your opinion. And we'll decide if your opinion is legit. So we're going to start with the walls. I love the subject of the walls of Jericho. As you have now seen, I've stood beside those walls. And those were supposed to fall, weren't they? Well, we're going to visit with an archaeologist named Bryant Wood, okay? And Dr. Wood is, after Dr. Wood, then we'll go to Jericho. So let's pay attention with what Dr. Wood has to say.
With regard to the walls falling, the Hebrew wording there is extremely precise. Now, all of our translations say the walls fell flat.
Right.
That's okay, I guess, but really the Hebrews tells you a little bit more. The Hebrew word is one word. The walls fell takatha, and that literally means fell beneath themselves. And that's exactly what we have there at Jericho. These walls, when they fell, had to collapse down the embankment or fall off that retaining wall beneath themselves. They were deposited at the base of the tell. And then the Israelite soldiers went up. Again, a small detail, but a later writer would have never known they had to go up. He would have said they rushed into the city.
Right.
But the Bible says they went up into the city. Very precise eyewitness account.
I think only archaeologists would come here or get away with this.
Well,
Standing on the retaining wall of Jericho.
you're standing where few have stood, and where we were standing, there was 30 feet of mud brick, and the excavations revealed several courses still clinging to the wall. They've now decomposed, but you can see where it collapsed outward, and in the bulk, the remnant of that red mud brick that created the ramp. And the Bible's very specific. The Israelites went up into the city.
And it sounds like anywhere they were around the city, they could have gone up into the city.
So that simultaneously they would have sieged the city. The inhabitants had no chance.
And you can almost imagine the size of this wall, because it would have been, what, 6 feet?
Yep.
Wide, and that would have been 30 feet tall, and you're already how far above the ground?
Well, 20 feet at its highest point of stone. So the stone wall's 20 feet, the mud brick is another 30, so 50
And then you have
feet.
another course of mud bricks at the top of the tell that are the same height. So when the Bible describes it as a city reaching up into the heavens, it must have looked impossible.
recap that if you didn't catch it all. The walls of Jericho were made of two parts. Now, our picture's faded a little, but our artist's rendition here is very good. You see the lighter tan here at the bottom? That is a stone revetment wall. I would call it a foundation wall. That's 20 foot tall. On top of it was another 30 feet of mud brick on top of the stone, all right? So, you have about a 50-foot tall wall built of two parts, stone and then mud brick. What fell? Did anybody catch that? What part fell? The mud brick, yeah. All right, so everywhere, there's been several excavations of Jericho. Everywhere they excavate, all around the city, guess what happened to the mud brick? It fell, okay? And it did something fascinating, all right? Now, we've color-coded this to help you see. Remember Dr. Kenyon that doesn't believe the Bible? This is her drawing. That stone revetment wall I've been telling you about is represented by the black stone wall here. As they excavated all around the city, they found fallen mud brick, and it did something weird. It didn't crumble down, it didn't fall in, it fell out in front of the stone in an interesting way. We've colored it so you can see. Do you see what it does over the stone base? And did you hear what they said? The word in Hebrew is they went up. Not that they rushed through the gate, not that they rushed in, they went up into the city. Ladies and gentlemen, the mud brick fell and literally created a ramp over the stone section of wall. Only an eyewitness would know that. Okay? So they rushed up into the city over the stone wall. All right? Now hang on, Tommy. You said they fell all around the city. What about a lady named Rahab? Well, if you remember Rahab's story, she hid the spies and was told her and her family would be saved. Where was Rahab's house? On the wall. On the wall, okay? Joshua 2:15. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, since she lived in a house that was built into the wall of the city. So, let's go back to Jericho.
But we are on the north side of the city, so that's significant because
Well, it is.
of...
Well, what we know from the archaeological record matches the biblical account very nicely. The Bible tells us that the walls of Jericho fell down except for one section. There was a woman named
Rahab.
And we read about her in the genealogy of Jesus, don't we?
And the reason it's the north section is where she's believed to have lived is because it was near the wilderness and the spies escaped right into that area. Is that right?
And possibly, though, it's just to the mountains nearby. I mean, it's probably...
This would be the closest place to that location, so it makes sense.
We don't make this stuff up, Jim, you understand. We just, it's this is the way that it was excavated, is all the walls fell down except one section on the north. So, give me another explanation.
Yeah, I'll take the Bible.
All right, we'll just have a look. And here we are on the northern most part of Tel Jericho. And it's here that we believe that the spies were escaped, if you will, out of Rahab's house, and the scarlet thread hung from the window. They probably fled to the mountains over here. And it's this section of the wall, Jim, that did not collapse.
So when several people excavated here, they found the mud brick walls were still intact here.
Right. All the excavators, not only here, but in other sections, at least several courses. But here they were completely preserved.
And the Bible describes Rahab's house being built into the wall or on the wall, which is unusual language.
Right, and that's exactly what it was. This is how the excavators found it. They were literally built on top of or into the wall.
If you didn't catch all that, on the northeast corner of Jericho, the 19-teens German team did find a section where the mud brick wall didn't fall. That was built on top of it. And did you catch what was preserved on top of the wall? Houses, rooms. All right. So I would submit to you, that's probably where Rahab lived. Now, I know I had one couple. How many people here have been to Israel? How many have been to Jericho? Anybody? Okay. If you've been to Jericho, when you walk into the parking lot and you go through the front gate, you are on the plain, and all behind you is open plain back to the Jordan River, okay? And here's the side of Jericho. Now, the side you come in is where I took the picture with the wall. The northeast corner that they're talking about is completely on the opposite side, okay? Ladies and gentlemen, if that's where Rahab's house was, it so comes to life for me. I wish you could see what's in my mind. Because see, on the other side of this tale is where the mountains are. If her house is on the side where you come in at the parking lot, they've got to go around the whole city. They're going to be captured. She literally lives on the side where she lets them out and they have a straight shot to the mountains. All right? And you know, it's like Dr. Stripling says, the evidence is what it is. You can't make this stuff up. But it illuminates it so well when we talk about the Bible. All right? Now, so to clarify, the walls fell everywhere except one spot, and that's Rahab's house. All right? The spies would have access to flee to the mountains from that side. There's a whole lot more we can talk about Jericho, but you've had your 5 minutes. So if you want to hear that, we got to do the walls of Jericho, but not tonight. Now we're going to move on to the next side of the conquest, and you probably know a little less about it, but this is my reminder to do something, because if I don't do it now, I forget. So I have to put a reminder in there. Okay, let me find a couple good ones. Just a second. That's not what I want. All right. I'm going to hand you a pottery sherd, and you're going to pass it around your section. I'll tell you why later, all right? If you come to one of my presentations, I make sure everybody handles an authentic piece of ancient history, and this is one of the ways to do it. We'll get back to that in a minute, okay? So the next side of the conquest was a place called Ai. By the way, if you're in the back of the room, it's your responsibility to get that back to me, all right? The next side of the conquest was a place called Ai. In the mountains or in the States, I've always heard it called Ai. In Israel, it's pronounced I, and I'm trained to call it I. So when I say I, you can think Ai, okay? All right. Everybody agreed that it was in a place called Et Tel, all right? And in the 1960s and early 70s, a Bible-believing Baptist archaeologist named Joseph Calloway went to Et Tel to show the world Joshua's Ai, basically in response to Kathleen Kenyon's results at Jericho. He basically said, I'm going to go to Et Tel and show the world the Bible's reliable and show them the remains from Joshua's conquest of Ai. And when he got done, his announcement was, there is no evidence of any fortress or anything from the time of Joshua at Et Tel. And ladies and gentlemen, from the 1950s and 60s, the archaeological interpretations of Jericho and Ai are one of your main reasons that people begin to question the historical reliability of the Old Testament. We've already talked about Kathleen Kenyon and how she got it wrong. How about Joseph Calloway and the fortress of Ai? Okay? Here's what the experts again would say. There's no evidence of a second millennium Canaanite city at this spot, Et Tel, or any other spot in the region. This constitutes unequivocal archaeological evidence for the lack of correlation between the story in Joshua 8 with all its topographic details and historical reality. My organization that I work with, ABR, was formed to solve the problem of Ai. All right? Our founder was a guy named David Livingston. He researched other sites in the area, and he decided he thought Ai may be in a place called Khirbet Nissia. So ABR excavated our first 20 years at Khirbet Nissia, and the fairest thing to say is Dr. Livingston was convinced, and basically nobody else. All right? The evidence really isn't that good for Ai at Khirbet Nissia. Then in the mid-1940s, a guy named Bryant Wood, you've already heard from Dr. Wood once tonight, okay? Dr. Wood is literally, this guy's interesting, you need to look him up. He was literally a rocket scientist who read a book about archaeology and decided he wanted to go back to school and become a biblical archaeologist. I've met him both, sweet man and his wife was with the kids. Oh yeah, he said we had to spend every vacation going to a museum somewhere in the world, you know. And so Dr. Wood did become an archaeologist, and he became an expert on late Bronze Age pottery. Got his PhD in it. Late Bronze Age is the period of the conquest, and he was looking at a report about pottery that had been picked up off the surface from an obscure place called Khirbet El Maqader. Okay, so in 1995 he launched an excavation at Khirbet El Maqader. Now, What I want to tell you is they began to excavate, and here's the story as I understand it. I wasn't there in 1995. He was told, Dr. Wood, you ain't going to find nothing there but an early Christian Byzantine church. He said, but I have a report with pottery from the time of Joshua. Nope, nothing there but a church. There was the only thing ever there. It's the only thing that'll ever be there. So he went to excavate. You know what he found? Church. And he's digging the pottery, and he's like, but where? And as I understand the story, there was a fella. Now this is out kind of in the wilds. There was no porta potty. There was no public bathroom. The call of nature literally was the call of nature. So the fella had the call, and he went over the hill. And he was gone. And he was gone. And he was gone longer than he should have been. He didn't come back. Finally, he come wandering back, and he walks to Dr. Wood, and in his two hands, he has a pile of ancient pottery. And he goes to Dr. Wood and says, Dr. Wood, what is this? And Dr. Wood nearly has a coronary. He says, where did this come from? See, Dr. Wood knows. He was looking at pottery from the time of Joshua. He said there's all kinds of it right down over the hill where no one ever bothered to go look. And so they went down over the hill and began to excavate. Want to guess what they found? So I'll tell you a bit about the site. It's a half mile from the place called Et Tel, where everybody said I was. Okay? Dr. Wood found a late Bronze Age fortress right down over the hill. All right? From the time of the conquest. Also, when he found his fortress, he begins to say, oh my, what do I have? And he begins to look at the clues in the Bible, the topography, the lay of the land. And unlike sites like Jericho, Joshua 7 and 8 gives 8 clues to what the lay of the land must have looked like around the site in the fortress of Ai. And he realizes that tale matched 1 or 2. Khirbet el-Makadar, all 8. All right? And then as he excavated, it becomes apparent someone destroyed the fortress right around the year 1400 BC. Ladies and gentlemen, if the Exodus was 1446, how long were those wilderness? 40 years. So when's the conquest? Right around 1406 BC. Somebody destroyed that fortress around 1400 BC. Joshua chapter 8, verse 28. Joshua burned Ai and left it a permanent ruin, desolate to this day. Let's look into this verse.
And this would have been a really strong, heavily fortified Canaanite city. It all fits. The soldiers are drawn out. The ambush force, you have the timing of it, comes in from behind, and they defeat the inhabitants of Ai and conquer the city. They also were told that they could plunder this city.
Right.
And they did, but they also then destroyed it by fire. What did you find?
Okay. Only 3 cities are destroyed by fire in the conquest: Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. So the question is, do we have evidence of burn? If we didn't, that would mean it didn't happen, because lots of things could happen to this. But in fact, we did find evidence of burn in numerous locations, including in the gate where the bedrock itself is calcined. And all of the late bronze, what we would call 1B pottery, is refired. So it was fired initially in a kiln, and then a second time in a conflagration.
The strongest evidence we have for the destruction of the fortress by fire is, again, the pottery, because we are finding pottery that's been what we call refired. Now, when a pot is fired in the kiln, it takes it up to a certain temperature, and that makes it good and hard, and it will last, you know. But we have found pottery sherds that have been subjected to an even higher temperature than the original firing temperature, and it makes it extremely hard. And our pottery normally wouldn't be so hard. We call it metallic. It's very, very hard. It's like concrete almost. When you scrape it with a knife, it's just very, very hard.
So what Dr. Wood found was a fortress that meets all of the topographical descriptions in the book of Joshua chapter 7 or 8. That's in the right place, it's the right time, and somebody burned it to the ground around the same time the Bible says the Israelites destroyed Ai. All right? And I would submit to you what he found was the lost fortress of Ai. Here's the difference. When Joseph Calloway in the 1960s made his announcement, he made world news. Want to think any secular media picked up Dr. Wood's story? Mm-mm. That's the world we live in today. Most people will never hear, unless you go looking, this information. All right? We're trying to get it out there, but it doesn't make the popular, But we're starting to get into getting soaked into the archaeology stuff, so it's showing up now in a lot more material. And there's one other thing. Those burnt pottery sherds. All across the site, the pottery was subjected to an intense fire. One of the evidence the site was burned. Talking about making it really hard. But those handles that I passed around, where are they? If you handle that, if Dr. Wood or Dr. Stripling were here tonight, they would tell you, you handled in your hand evidence of the burning of Ai from the book of Joshua, chapter 8. That's where those are from, all right? I was very privileged to be given a bag full of those for these presentations, literally burnt pottery from the site of Ai. If you are interested, there's a whole box of it up there. I picked out two of the best pieces in my opinion, and clearly we can see our handles. So I like to tell you, if I get a chance to put actual biblical history in your hands, I'd like to tell you tonight you handled biblical history. But we're going to move on. And this one is a story I'm going to give you just a little information on that you can look up that's in the news today, these days. Had a press conference about it recently. For a few years, I had a secret. And I couldn't tell my groups when I went and talked. I would usually say something like, there's something big coming. You'll have to get me come back to tell you. So after Jericho and Ai, the Israelites had been told by Moses, is directed by God, you are then to go have a ceremony. And it's to be on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal after you get a foothold in the land. And that's what they did after Jericho and Ai. And you're to put half the tribes on one mountain and half the tribes on the other. And basically, here's how the ceremony went. They spend all day. One side says, if I am faithful to my wife, a good husband, and I'll live a good, follow God's word, I will be blessed. And the other side said, yes and amen. And if I am unfaithful to my wife, if I lie, cheat, and steal, I shall be cursed. You get the picture. It goes back and forth all day as they talk about God's promises and his commandments and what God says about blessing and cursing. All right? Well, on the mountain of the curse, an archaeologist in the 1980s, Mount Ebal, the text refers to an altar. By the way, the altar's on Mount Ebal. That's the mountain of the curse. Why would the altar be on the curse, not the mountain of blessing? Anybody got a thought? That's exactly right. That's where it's needed. All right? Yeah, when we sin, that's where we need it. Exactly. So that's where it's at. In the 80s, an Israeli-trained, non-Bible believing archaeologist named Adam Zertal found an altar under a large pile of stones on Mount Ebal, dating to the 13th century BC. Now, remember we started earlier, and I was talking about the time of the Exodus? He said, I think, and he wasn't a Bible believer, and he took a picture of what he had found to a Jewish rabbi, and he said, I know what that is. And he brought him a book and showed him a picture of the Old Testament altar. And of course, Dr. Zertal also about had a coronary. He became a person of faith. Okay? Now, what Dr. Zertal had been taught was the Exodus was in the 1300s. I told you about 1300 altar. What he also excavated that didn't get the news, underneath that altar from the 1300s is an altar from the mid-1400s. And it appears about 200 years later, somebody came back and venerated the older altar. When did I tell you the Exodus and Conquest was? 1400s, all right? Now here's what's fascinating. We were very interested in this site. It's also in a politically sensitive area. It's one of the few things I've done in Israel that I didn't tell my wife because I got to go visit it in a bomb-proof, bulletproof bus with a military escort. We didn't bring that up until I accidentally mentioned it, and she said, you did what? And I had to confess. But our team is very interested in the site, and we studied Zertal's work. Because of the political sensitivities, we can't do any excavation there now, but we have developed and made popular a archaeological process called wet sifting. Basically, you know, when you dig stuff up, you sift it, all right? No, it doesn't take an expert to figure if something small is covered in dirt and mud, even if you sift it out, it's going to look like a dirt clod. It's hard to see. But what if you wash it? We wash at Shiloh. So we got permission to go in and remove. We knew where Dr. Zertal's dump pile was. When he had excavated the altar, we knew where he dumped all the sifted material. We went in, re-sifted it, and washed it. Our small finds expert one day picked up something. She thought it was a piece of clay, and her hand went like this. She said, "Oh, that's heavy," and she knew exactly it wasn't clay. She knew it was lead. About a postage stamp size, you see two sides of it up top, is what she had in her hand. She took it to Dr. Stripling immediately because they both knew what it was. Popular in the ancient world in lead and folded over is what we call a curse tablet. Ladies and gentlemen, where was this from? The mountain of the curse. All right? They tried to open it because most of the time, you know what's on the inside? Writing. And they realized they'd destroyed it if they opened it. And we were all excited. I got to hear all about it, and then I was told to keep my mouth shut. I could tell nobody. All right, well, and then COVID hit. Oh. And then finally, as the pandemic slowed down, we were able to take it to a university in Europe that was experts on scanning lead, and that said we can scan it, and we will be able to show you what's on the inside. Long story short, we have all the scans, and several months ago they made a public announcement. We can read the inside. Sorry. It's the oldest Hebrew ever found in Israel. It has the name of God twice. Yahweh. Yahweh. All right? And it's a curse tablet. It says, and somebody told me, said, I don't want to hear this during the pandemic. That sounds bad. It says, cursed, cursed, cursed. By the God Yahweh, you shall be cursed. You have to understand what the poem is. Where was it? All right? And it's the stuff from the early altar. It's basically saying, if I don't live life God's way, I will be cursed. You talk about creating a firestorm. See, the writing dates, the lead dates, all to the time of Joshua. And if you don't believe the Bible, this is a problem. So we've been highly criticized and skeptical, but it is one of the hottest items in biblical archaeology today. And if you want to see the name of God in Proto-Hebrew, here it is, the name Yahweh. It appears twice on the tablet. Do you all want to know a secret? They're recording me, so I can't tell you too much. There's also writing on the outside. But that's a different presentation. All right, so now we got to move on to my favorite archaeological site, a place called Shiloh. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there. And the land was subdued before them. We call Shiloh the first capital of Israel, all right? So this is a small taste of what we're going to do in the morning. And this is where Joshua put the tabernacle of the Ark of the Covenant. We have a whole lot of ancient pottery, pottery sherds on display here from Shiloh tonight, including stuff from the tabernacle period. So I want to make sure you get the opportunity to hold some of that. It's over here on the touch table. I do want to focus on one thing that is unique to Shiloh, and I'm going to let Dr. Stripling tell you about it, and then I'll tell you what it has to do with material here tonight. Before I do that, I need a volunteer. Will you help me? In the purple, right there. You look about the right height. Come on up.
We have something that no other site in Israel has. Around the entire perimeter, there are storage rooms, big storage rooms. And they date to the period before the Israelites were there, because the pottery at the bottom is Canaanite Amorite pottery. And on top of that, we have the classic collared rim jar, which is what we would call the Israelite storage jar, very typical. So you can see that it was used. You're going to occupy cities you didn't build, you're going to live in houses you didn't construct. They're using these storage rooms. Now, this begs the question, why all these storage rooms. What is unique about Shiloh? Why does no other site have this configuration? Well, this is a really nice shot of these storage rooms. When people tithed in biblical times, how did they do that?
They brought grain, they brought items because they didn't have coins anyways.
Yeah.
But you're bringing your
But
offerings
they would
to
bring
the Lord.
commodities. So what do we find? A material culture that matches what we read. It's what I call verisimilitude. It matches what we read in the text. Storage rooms, bone deposit, horned altar, pomegranates, it all begins to add up.
And looking like there could have been a platform here in this area.
Yeah.
Lee is going to help us out. Y'all give her a big hand. All right. I want her to stand right here in the middle. Now, put it up about where I showed you. All right. Now, move your hands here to the edges. They need to see the pottery piece. I want you all to look at the big picture up here, okay? Now, this is an intact pithos on display in the Israeli Museum, and that thing would be about as tall as what Jamie Lee's holding here. So you can see it'd be hard to put that in my suitcase. But I want you to look at the top of it, look at the rim, and look at what Jamie Lee's holding. Does that look similar to you? Yeah. So, on display are parts of 2 pithos from those storage rooms. All right, so all around the perimeter at Shiloh, we find storage rooms. Why? There's no change, there's no money this time. You bring your tithes, there has to be, your tithes and offering is commodity. So you have to have somewhere to store all this stuff. She's holding a pithos rim from an iron 1 pithos. When this was found out of context, otherwise it would be in our scientific report, it got discarded accidentally by a previous excavation. Dr. Stripling was going to put it in his teaching set in Israel. I'm not shy to ask questions. I said, Dr. Stripling, if you do that, 50 people a summer will see it. You send that to me to Kentucky, 2,000, 3,000 a year, we'll get to see this pottery piece. And he goes, I'll think about it. I'll tell you tomorrow. And Dr. Stripling's answer in the morning was, Tommy Chamberlin, I know you. I'm going to let you take the pithos rim. But don't you forget, it's not yours. It's mine. It comes home to me one day. Ladies and gentlemen, that was about 5 years ago. I've never mentioned it to him again, and I won't. He's going to have to remember I've got it if he wants it back. Don't everybody share this video with him. But here's the thing. What's the cool thing? Why did I get Jamie up here? To show you how big from this one piece. Imagine this going all the way to the floor, this big storage jar. We're going to call Jamie a pithos. What is she holding? She is literally holding pottery from the Israelite sacrificial system, maybe from the ballpark of the life of Samuel himself. This is one of the coolest biblical contexts I can let you hold and touch, and she just got a little more nervous than she was when I got her out of her seat. All right? So if you don't care to put that back in the display for me, sweetie, thank you so much. Give her a big hand for helping us out. Okay? So it's really rare to have something on a display like this we can connect so directly to a biblical history. But I do want to show you one other one. We have an intact pithos rim. So over here as well is this one. Check that out. All right? So the whole thing is here. All right? This one predates the Israelite period. This is Canaanite. Let's say 1700 to 1600 BC. And the reason I like to show this one is the guy in the picture excavated it. All right? And so that is one of my favorite personal discoveries. And I'm really proud to share it with you here today. We thought we had the whole thing. And we tried to restore it. And we had about one half. And so, oh well. Now, that's Team Purple from last summer. That's my group from last summer. And there I am right there. And we were excavating and in AE 29. It might be hard to see, but I wanted to show you maybe a little bit about what we found last summer. I'll talk about this more in the morning. You see the big wall here? All right? You notice how the rocks just kind of end? This is the big fortification wall that surrounds Shiloh. Now, I'm no military expert, but the holes in your fortification wall cause a problem? I would think so. So there has to be a reason. Why was there a big hole in the wall? All right? Here's what I'll tell you. I'll give you a clue. The gate of Shiloh has never been found until last summer. All right? We'll talk about that more in the morning. I got the privilege to help excavate part of the gate. We think this is part of the chamber. The entrance is over here. If you read the text, Eli dies in the gate. So I literally got to ask myself the question about excavating a spot that literally a biblical event happened. That's cool, and it's exciting to share it with you. But that is my teaser to say come in the morning and learn more. All right, so we're going to move on to one of my favorite accounts from the Old Testament. And I like to mention a place called Azekah here. Anybody ever heard of that? Azekah, okay? We're going to bring a story to life. And we're going to start with a verse, then join Barry and Jeremy in one of my favorite places in Israel. I'm going to read the verse to you, and you can figure out if you think what this might be. I'm going to need somebody to help me, probably a young boy. How about you? Will you help me, young man? Okay, you come on up. Here's our verse. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soka in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Damim between Soka and Azekah. What is this talking about? Let's go to the place and find out.
After Saul was rejected by God and Samuel, you try to imagine how much turmoil he must have felt, trying to figure out when his time as king of Israel would be over. Samuel, in secret, anoints David, but he hasn't been installed as a king yet. Saul is trying to fight these battles with the Philistines, wondering when he's going to be replaced.
And that brings us to one of the most famous stories in all of the Old Testament, as we walk beside a brook in the Valley of Elah. If I were to ask someone, tell me the story of David and Goliath, they would tell me that there was this giant, he came and fought against the Israelites, and it was a wonderful opportunity to show the faith of David. And they would be exactly right. That's the right story. But the Bible tells it a little bit differently. The Bible scopes it in geography. In 1 Samuel 17, it starts off and says, now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and so they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and Soka is located just along that ridge over there on the eastern end of the valley. And they encamped between Soka and Azekah. Now Azekah sits just around the corner here. So we are in between Soka and Azekah. It said Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up a line of battle against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, that mountain over there, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley in between them. And that's how the Bible sets up this story. Then it introduces the main characters of the story.
Well, then later on we know that when David finally went down to battle with Goliath, he didn't use any of Saul's armor or his sword, but he crosses a brook and picks up 5 smooth stones.
Right, and of course we just crossed the brook ourselves right here below us.
So he would have come down from the Israelite camp, crossed that brook, and then gone down into the valley.
That's exactly right. Then David came out here and faced the giant, and I believe at that point he gives one of the most moving speeches that's in all of the Bible. In 1 Samuel 17, after Goliath has taunted him, it says in verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Such a beautiful speech, and of course we know that as soon as he finished that, he took one of those stones, put it in his sling, and killed Goliath.
The writer of 1 Samuel is establishing David.
Barry and Jeremy there. I want to introduce you to my assistant. Come here just a second. What was your name, young man? David. Everybody say hello, David. All right. So when we think of David and Goliath, we think of a young man, But the Hebrew, the word that we translate youth in English, means young warrior, okay? David's not a little boy, okay? He got a little meat on his bones. Probably a late teenager, all right? And we imagine a little guy with his slingshot and a pebble. David, or Chase, is holding an authentic Iron Age sling stone. All right. Now, Chase, is that really lightweight?
No.
Not really. Let me ask you this. He's going to be our expert. If I ratchet that up about 100 to 125 miles an hour, which is what we can do with a sling, and I put it right here and hit you with it at that speed, what's he going to do to you?
Probably kill me.
Probably kill me, if you didn't hear the answer. That I think so is too. So if you don't handle anything else at our touch table, pick up the sling stone. The weight is an educator. Now, we often imagine, so the little pebble, but it's not that. It's one of these. It's got some oomph to it. But what about that slingshot? Well, it's not a slingshot, ladies and gentlemen. It's a sling. And here's my replica sling, and let's see if I can do this without taking anybody's head off. All right, so it's probably up here. It's like one of these. All right, now I'm going to walk. David ran. Now listen, I was a college baseball pitcher on scholarship. One Red Scout said I had the best fastball he ever saw in a little guy. I never knew if that was a compliment or an insult. To quote my center fielder, I could chunk that tater. Okay? Now I would imagine if I had one of these and you let me get a run and go, I'm going to tear your head off. Okay? That's what I imagine for David. So when we think of David and Goliath, and we think of David's choice of weapons, it's a little different than the way. We've made the story God's miracle for David. Do not misunderstand me. God is clearly in the story. But I think it's a little different way than we imagine it. You see, when David got up that morning, he didn't know he was going to face Goliath. But David's been a shepherd all his life. And David was a teenage boy. I remember being a teenage boy, and every man in the room does too. And you got to do something to fill up that boredom. Now, maybe in some generations we had the BB gun or our gun, and we shot things off the fence. My guess is David is something like that. If they're taking care of them sheep, getting bored every day. My guess is David is becoming an expert with a sling. And you see, when he gets up and he goes to face Goliath that day, Goliath's a big, ugly guy. He talks a lot of smack, and he's bad. And you don't want to get in that man's wheelhouse because he ain't going to work out for you. But you see, if you need a weapon to reach out and touch him, Goliath has a javelin. They can go so far. Guess what goes farther? This. He is prepared. He is an expert in the exact weapon he needs to face his biggest enemy, to reach out and touch him from a distance. And you see, God prepared him every day for a fight he never knew he'd have till he came. Guess what? He will you too. That's the story of David and Goliath. All right? Now with that said, let's give Chase a big hand. Thank him for helping out. And if you don't handle anything else tonight, I won't pass it around because there's so many of us. If you don't handle anything else tonight, go over to the touch display, pick up the sling stone, okay? But don't do what I did with the sling. That may not work out. I've practiced a little bit. So, all right. Now, I promised we'd dig a little bit into translation and the importance of a word. So, when I encourage you to study your Bible, there's so much to be learned. You know, when I was growing up in church, we went to church every Sunday morning, every Sunday night. We lived too far to go on Wednesday night, but if there was revival, we went, okay? By the time I was in my early 20s, I knew it all. Or I thought I did. And what I've learned as I've gotten older and I've studied the Bible is how much I don't know. And what I would encourage you is if you've spent your whole life and you know God's Word backward and forward, there is stuff still for you to learn. I encourage you to be a student of the Bible. And one of the examples for me, one of the best examples, comes into the translation and the understanding the original languages. So we're obviously reading an English translation. And if we understand the Hebrew and Greek better, I think we get a better picture. And I'm going to show you an example from one of my favorite verses for this, and it's Jeremiah 17:5 and 6. We're going to read it in the King James. Thus saith the Lord, Cursed be the man that trusteth in man, and maketh flesh his arm, and whose heart departeth from the Lord. For he shall be like the heath, what is that, in the desert. The NIV. This is what the Lord says. Cursed is the one who trusted man, who draws strength from mere flesh, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person shall be like a bush in the wastelands. The ESV, thus says the Lord. Cursed is the man who trusts in the Lord, in man, and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord. He is like a shrub in the desert. Didn't have a clue there for myself. So here's what we're going to do. Dr. Stripling is going to bring this verse to life for you a little bit, okay? And we're going to focus on that word I bolded in. And I believe we may change your understanding a little. But I wish you could get it the way I did the first time. The first time I heard this explained, I was walking through the Judean desert. It's like 110 degrees, all right? The air-conditioned bus is way back over there, and we're walking through an area where the local Bedouin have killed a goat 3 days ago. You imagine the smell, all right? That wonderful smell. As Dr. Stripling says, stop, get your cameras out. And I'm like, Dr. Stripling, are you sure? Here? And that's the lesson I got, and it was worth it, smell and all. So let's hear what he's got to say.
While waiting for Abraham to use his smartphone while sitting on a donkey to find us some camels, Scott noticed an interesting bush. The fruit looked appetizing, but looks are often deceiving.
Here we are at a bush that is very important in the Bible, but almost no one knows about it. Jeremiah 17:5 says, "Cursed is the man who has turned his heart away from God. He will be like a bush, tree, shrub." The English translations don't know what to do with the word, same way in other languages too. The Hebrew word is arara, A-R-A-R-A. This is an arara. Now let's think about that for a minute. Cursed is the man who has turned his heart away from God. He will be like an arara. So what is this like? How does this represent a man who has turned his heart away from God? Well, think about it. It's beautiful on the outside, right? It's got this gorgeous fruit, looks like a grapefruit. And when we pull one, feel it, nice and soft. All right, so
Wow.
on the outside, everything looks great.
Right.
And especially think about our younger culture today. There's such pressure about cosmetically, how you
External,
look. And
right.
I mean, I'm all for look as good as you can, but don't dare trust that as a means of righteousness. Now, what happens in life is we get squeezed. And I want you to watch what happens when we get squeezed. Okay, there's nothing on the inside except a seed and poison. That white stuff, which is now on my hands, which
Okay.
we're gonna wash off in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
That
I'm glad you did this illustration.
that will kill you. Now, let's read the text again. Cursed is the man who has turned his heart away from God. He will be like an aurora. He'll look great on the outside, but when you squeeze him, all there is on the inside is hot air and death.
That'll preach.
But that will work.
Yeah.
The verse continues, and Jeremiah writes, "But blessed is the man whose heart is turned toward the Lord. He will be like a tree planted by a river of living water that brings forth its fruit in season." So you see the juxtaposition, the tree of death and the tree of life. It all has to do with the orientation of our heart.
And I would have walked right past that.
Well, there's, like we say, there's a lesson under every stone.
Thank you.
Let's get this poison off.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so I think you probably got that. It's one of my favorite simple examples of why studying the language is so important. It changes the whole verse, all right, and brings it to life. But I can't think of one of those and not think of that smell. And so that's it for me. Now, it looks like I picked the shorter version. I've got a little bit of New Testament tonight. So I'm going to take just a minute to give you a little information on a couple things that will be in the longer version for just a second. 2 artifacts over here I think you should see when you get time. This broken jar handle has a stamp on it. The stamp has a winged figure like an eagle. If you look up Lamelech, L-M-L-K, that is a Lamelech seal on display in the church tonight. We have a stamp seal of a king of Judah. It is the real thing. It is King Hezekiah from the Old Testament. It is his official seal. And these say the English says belonging, or the English translation will be belonging to the king. And this is the period right before the Assyrian conquest. The other one is a broken idol. Maybe if you grew up in church like me and the preacher was talking about an idol, I always imagine this big metal or wood thing up on top of a hill. And all through the prophets period of the Old Testament, the prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, they continue to say, put away your idols. And archaeologically, we find something interesting. If you look at this figure, she's missing a head. And you notice I said she, because if you look close, she's clearly female, okay? And she's missing her head. Most of them, she would have a head, and it comes down. They're called Judean pillar figurines. Over 1,000 of these have been found in archaeological excavations. They are probably Asherahs, fertility idols. Guess where we tend to find them archaeologically? Generally from homes we identify as Israelite. They're going to the house of God and worshiping God, and they're going home and hedging their bets with fertility idols. And that's what the prophets are talking about. Put away your idols. You know, they're trying to have it both ways. And if you don't know much about God, you don't get it both ways. All right? And so here's the thing about our particular idol. I'd like to think whoever had that got the message. Look at her neck. It ain't jagged. It ain't rough. It's smooth. How do you put away your idol? You cut its head off. I think maybe, I'd like to think this one, somebody did the right thing. Now with that said, let's dive into the New Testament. This is a rendering of the previous site ABR excavated, Khirbet el-Maqadir. This is the first century village. You've heard me talk about the 14th century fort tonight, but this is what the first century village looked like. We'll talk about that in just a second. This guy's a guy named Herod the Great. I don't remember why I put him in there. It's been a while since I've done this presentation. I remember why. I don't have the sherds with me. We'll skip him. All right, but here's what I want to talk about. So let's skip to the Last Supper. Jesus has his Last Supper with his disciples in a kataluma, which is a guest room in Jerusalem. A little Christmas story for you. Baby Jesus is born in a place because there is no room in the English we say inn. In the Greek, it's that word kataluma. Now I'm going to puzzle you. Luke uses the exact same word for the Last Supper. He describes those two things. Is Jesus' Last Supper in a hotel, motel, or inn? It's clearly somebody's upstairs guest room. So in the Christmas story, when it says there was no room for them in the kataluma, it might not be quite what we're thinking. But that's a different story, all right? In this one, Jesus is having his Last Supper in a kataluma, a guest room in Jerusalem. And it says, and he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink ye all of it. For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. Well, my hero is a guy named Indiana Jones. If you haven't guessed that, I think I told you earlier. And in his third movie, he went looking for the Holy Grail. Now, when I used to do these presentations, I'd have a lot of fun, and I never told them in advance. And the pastor is off the hook tonight, and he had no idea. Because you see, I would usually have a display of 4 grails up here, 3 replicas, and 1 real. Now, if he's seen the movie, he might be tempted to pick the one from the movie. It ain't right. All right? So I'd always call the pastor up and say, Pastor, which is it? And then I get to do the cool line. He picked foolishly or he picked wisely? Well, pastor already knows what the cup is. And so we're not going to have that fun tonight. But the point is, we have a good idea what style of cup Jesus passed at the Last Supper. See, in the first century, Jewish people were becoming obsessed with ritual purity. We see this all through the New Testament. The disciples are breaking the rules. They're breaking the purity rules. And we find it in all kinds of ways in the material culture. They don't want to be, they are, the way I would describe it is they're becoming super or extra religious. Why would that be? Well, Tommy's theory is they're expecting someone, okay, a guy named Messiah, all right, and they're getting on board. So, like even the rules about art, if you know the archaeology, a couple centuries before on their pottery, the oil lamps, they didn't care to fudge the rules a little. But we get to this time period, it's all by the book. And there's some verses in the Old Testament that talks about how things can become impure. And when your pottery becomes impure, you must break it, says the Lord. When's the last time y'all took your kitchen dishes out and broke them because they were impure and got rid of them and got new stuff? It's in the Old Testament, right? He goes through all the stuff that can become impure. Guess what's never listed as something that can become impure? Stone. So, how does the human mind work? Stone's not on the bad list. So if we make our stuff of stone, it can never go bad. Okay? So, on display, we have a first century stone mug. These stone vessels were used for about 100 years. In a window, you would approximately know as the New Testament. Okay? And if you are an archaeologist and you find these stone vessels on your site and you don't know what the site is, it's a really big clue your site's Jewish. Because it was Jewish people that used them, and only for a short window in history. It's also a clue that it's a first century site. Okay? Now, the cup here is from our site at Khirbet el-Makadar. We believe the first century village at Khirbet el-Makadar is a place called Ephraim. In John chapter 11, Jesus and his disciples visit Ephraim. So that's an interesting connection to our artifact here today. There's a picture of it. But here's the simple thing. If you're the Jewish host of that home, and it's an important meal, a ritual meal, it's a holiday, we would call it, it's Passover, would you let that important rabbi and his followers have their Passover meal with utensils that could have become impure? The answer is no. They almost certainly would have used stoneware. So the very cup Jesus passed at the Last Supper, we suspect, is one of these. Okay? So it's over here in the display. This one is from the site that we think is Ephraim. If we're right, then we're talking about a site Jesus of Nazareth himself visited. It is one of my favorite artifacts on display. If you want to hold one, there's a broken bottom of one over in the touch display. And it literally, to me, is a connection to the time of Jesus. All right? Now, in this case right here is a coin you don't want to miss. It's called the shekel of Tyre. And if you lived in the first century, you could only pay your temple tax with those. Remember those money changers Jesus got so upset at? See, you had to bring your money and exchange it with them, and it was for a foreign currency from the Phoenician city of Tyre or Tyre. I never know which way to say it. And on the face of those coins, if you can look here, somebody already asked me tonight, oh, is that Caesar, Tommy? Ladies and gentlemen, that is not Caesar on the face of the coin. It's a pagan deity named Melkart. Later on, you might call him Hercules. Okay? This ain't Disney's Hercules. So, what does that mean? At the temple of the one true God in Jerusalem, you can only pay your temple tax with a coin with an idol's image right on the front. And we go back to Jesus and the money changers. In my mind, I might add a little more element about what he's upset about. I wonder, literally using idols' images in paying your temple tax. Because the Jewish leadership passed a special rule at the time, said that's the only coin we'll take. Why was that? You see, your average Roman denarius had about 80% pure silver. The Phoenician one, a lower estimate's 92. All right? It's a money racket. Ladies and gentlemen, if that coin is the silver coin that the temple treasury is full of, when a guy named Judas comes, I'll betray him, and they give him 30 pieces of silver. See, when I was a kid, I literally thought 30 little pieces of silver. It's a slang term. It's like I'm telling you, I'm going to give you $30. You don't expect me to show up at your house with 30 deer. You expect $30. It's a slang term that means 30 silver shekels. Historians all agree it is that style of coin Judas is given. There's one on display right here on the top of the coin case, and that one's a little extra special. Those coins are like the coins today. They're datable. That coin dates to the year 30 AD. That's kind of cool because if you know the information, that is either the year Jesus is crucified or the year he begins his ministry. I think it's the year he begins his ministry, and I think he's crucified in 33. Other experts would disagree with me and say 30. The point is, that is ministry of Jesus' lifetime. We are literally looking at an artifact that's the type of thing Judas was given. So please check the coin out. And if somebody reminds me, it's kind of hard to see in there, I'll take the lid off and get it out when people come up, and I'll hold it and you can look at it if you want to see it. All right. So with that said, there's lots of other stuff here to see. I've actually not got one of the things up there that I've got, but there's lots. The large storage jar is mid-1st century, according to Dr. Stripling. So it's New Testament time, two decades life of Jesus. Our paperwork tells us it comes from a place called Bethany. That's pretty cool. All right. And there's several other things to see. Here's what you need to know about the display. I don't take any of this down till you all are done looking. You ain't just here for me to talk, I hope. I want you to enjoy looking at the artifacts and ask questions. I leave it all up to everybody who's enjoyed taking time and looking. Enjoy the touch table, and we'll wait till you're done with that, and I'll stay up here and answer questions.